Welcome to the interface tutorial. So we're not going to be doing anything crazy here. We're only going to be getting used to the environment of the software, right? Knowing where things are, knowing how to click or where to click, or how we essentially introduce instructions into the software, right? So I have Rhino 7 open. If you're working with Rhino 6 or Rhino 5, you may have some features that are missing that make the program a little bit more efficient in the newer versions, but you won't be missing out on anything quite major. So we're going to use a mouse and keyboard. The main things you have to know are you're going to use out of your mouse your left click for mainly selecting, of course. So if we look through the interface here, right? And I'm going to first go over this, right, top to bottom through the software. So at the top, we have our menu, right? Our menu bar. So file, edit, view, curve, surface, right? Essentially, you have almost most operations right up here in the title bar. If you go, depending on what category of geometry you're trying to create or what kind of modifier you're trying to introduce, as well as many other plugins might appear up here. For example, V-Ray is a rendering plugin, and for me, my V-Ray options also show up here all the way on the right. And that's because I installed that into Rhino. It wouldn't be on the default. So obviously, I'm left clicking up here to select different items in the menu. Now, the command window is right below that. So the command window here actually shows you what things you've been doing in the past. So it looks like I tried to redo something, but there's nothing to do. But essentially every instruction that you type into the software is going to show up here. And right under that is the command line. So that's where you're going to use your keyboard to basically type in any commands that you may want to use. Now, the commands are predetermined by Rhino. So for example, there is a box command. Right, and mostly for commands, you can do some searches. Like if I type box into the command line, you'll see I get other options show up underneath, right? So it's not just box, but I can see what other commands related to box may appear there. But by typing in box, you can see that I can also click on any command that shows up in that search, the command bar. Command prompt, that is the technical name, command prompt. So we'll type a command in the prompt, for example, line, right? That would be to draw a line. So now that we've initiated a command in the prompt, we're now being presented with some options. So the first instruction here is to start a line or start of line. And it has a whole bunch of options here, both sides, normal, angled, vertical, 4-point, and etc. So we're not going to worry about these right now. All you really need to know is that you can click on these options in order to enter another point, right, in the settings. So for example, if I click on vertical, right, now I've constrained that line to being a vertical line. I'm going to start that command again called line. Get those options again. The letter that is underlined for that option, that letter can be typed in. So if I wanted to do vertical again, but instead of clicking on vertical, I type V, right, because that's what's underlined, enter, I've now created that option. So I'll still do a vertical. So either way, you can mess with the command options that way. So obviously commands are instructions for the software. In this case, we're just drawing a line. So now it's asking me to determine the start of the line. I can do so in multiple ways. One way would be by clicking on a viewport. Right, so the viewports are located right here. Each one of these is a viewport. They're really just ways into looking into the 3D. By default, we start off with perspective, top, front, and right. So I could click anywhere here. So I'll click, for example, in perspective. And my line is constrained to being vertical, so I can only draw it vertically. However, let's say that instead of clicking in the middle of space, I wanted a specific dimension for this line. I could type it into the command line. So I'll type, for example, 10, and that'll be 10 units of whatever units the software set in. We'll go over that in a little bit. But you'll see that whether I go up or down, the endpoint of that line is now constrained to 10 units. So I'll run the command line once more, but rather than typing it in, I'll just hit spacebar. So hitting spacebar or enter after you finish the command will prompt that same command to happen again. This time, instead of clicking for the starting point, I can always start drawing a geometry at the origin of the model, right? Meaning where 0, 0, 0, where those coordinates are located, I can always start drawing there by simply typing 0 and hitting enter. Now I'm drawing my line. We can establish a random spot, but you'll see here also, I have this function where if I hover over this line, right now there's no help, right? I'm just kind of trying to draw in outer space. But if I hover over this endpoint, for example, on the other line, and then I move away from it, there is now a marker that remains on that line. And my endpoint is now following a guideline that's being drawn. So this function that allows you to do that is actually called smart tracking and is enabled at the very bottom of the screen right here, smart track. Turn that off by clicking on it. Now not bolded or highlighted in blue. If I try to do that now with a new line segment, I'm not able to do that same guide. We've gone over some aspects of the interface, kind of from the top, the viewports, and some options at the bottom, right? This is the most practical approach that I can have, right, in explaining these different areas. So I'll now go over some other commands and toolbars and reintroduce more elements in the interface that are going to be essential for you. Let's go over some of our tools. Now, our tools or commands are located in our toolbars. So there's several toolbars here. We have our main toolbar that's over on the left, right? And in this case, since I'm working on this tab called standard, the toolbars that are showing here are from all different categories of the software, right? So you'll notice that on the left-hand side, I have line commands, then I have some surface commands, some other commands to modify geometry and transform geometry. And then on this toolbar here at the top, I have, new document, save, print, restore viewports, set different views, hide, lock, your layers, right? All these different organizational tools. So you just have to know that your standard tab has a little bit of everything. So one thing to note about the toolbars as well is that the symbols actually have a graphic language as to what they are or what they do. So if you'll notice, the lines, right, or anything that's curved geometry, right, only has an endpoint and a connecting line. Things that are surfaces have this bluish tone to them. And things that typically transform geometry have either an orange or a gray element introduced to it. Some of these commands have more commands sort of compacted within them. And you know which ones those are because, like many other 3D softwares, they have this small little triangle on the bottom right that show that it has an expansive menu. So you'll see there, if I hover over the tool or the command, I actually get what's called a tool tip, which is that little bubble of text that shows up. And it actually shows you a little bit of how to continue with that tool. So it says here for box, if I were to left click, I'll create a box and establish a corner, then another corner, and then the height of that box. If I hover over that small triangle on the same box, bottom right of it, it says Cascade Solid Creation. So if I click there, I have this other window that opens that has many, many more solids for me. Solids are essentially surfaces that are closed, right? They're not 2D surfaces, they're 3D objects comprised of. And a solid technically has no openings, right? So you can have many 2D surfaces joined together, but if there's a missing 2D surface, that would not allow that geometry to be solid. This is more on topology. We'll talk more about that later in a different video on topologies of geometry. So we can select any one of these, right? I'll go ahead and select a cylinder. And again, we can follow along with the command prompt, base of the cylinder, solid, yes. So we'll take a look at that solid thing that we were talking about now. If I click over here to draw the center of a cylinder, right? Now I'm establishing a radius, right? And I have the option to change to establishing a diameter instead, right? So by typing D, I change to diameter, and I get the line that reads the diameter. Now I'm establishing the height. And I can also have an option here that says both sides no. If I type B to hit both sides yes, I'm now establishing that height in 2 directions from the center of the cylinder, right? Now, let's go over viewports a little bit, right? Because I told the program not to make a solid cylinder, but my viewports are in wireframe mode, which means I can only see the edges or the lines that infer geometry. I can't actually see the actual geometry, right? Everything's sort of in a wireframe view. So in order to make sure whether or not I made this cylinder solid or not, I need to switch to a different display mode, which you can do so by accessing your viewport menu right here. Have your viewport title here for perspective, right? And I can make this the main view that I'm working off of by double clicking on its title, double click on perspective. Now the small arrow to the right of perspective, that shows that menu. And we can see here we're working in wireframe, top thing. So I'll switch to shaded. And now that adds surfaces. Okay, so it looks like I did make it a solid. Not seeing through. So I'll run a cylinder again. This time, instead of choosing that tool, I'm gonna type cylinder, if I'm able to remember. So there we have cylinder. And I'll make sure that before I do that, that my solid option is on no. There. Check out the command history always, if I'm moving a little bit too fast for you. I'll draw that cylinder out, right to it, and we see that it's not solid, right? But I wouldn't be able to tell, right, if I switch back to wireframe mode, I wouldn't quite be able to tell from wireframe. So, shaded, right? Realize you have all these other default display modes as well, such as rendered, right? Rendered is something that really improved in Rhino 7. Ghosted. Ghosted I've been finding very useful as of late because it's that combination between shaded and wireframe. The next thing I'm going to go over are a few things that can help you be more productive, knowing that you can turn these options on or off in the way that you're working. So I'm quickly just going to make floors and a ceiling, right? And I'll go through using those options. Now, the first thing I want to bring your attention to on the status bar at the bottom is the units here for inches. So if I right click on inches, it brings me the setting to unit settings. And it brings up this window called document properties or Rhino options, depending on how you arrived here. And under units, it's taking us directly to model so that we can switch here from inches into anything else, say feet. You can also change the display of how those units are shown. So I'm going to switch to decimal. I just find that easier to be. Just find that to be easier for me. Hit OK. Now scaling the model. What this means is if I had modeled something in 1 inch and I meant for that to be 1 foot, I wouldn't want to scale the model, right? Because 1 unit is still 1 unit. However, if I had drawn something up in inches, right? And now I'm switching to feet, and I meant to draw it in inches first, but now I want to work in feet, I would scale the model because now the units or the numerical values need to change to adjust for the new scale. In this case, there's nothing in the model. I hit no. Next, ortho. So ortho will make sure that you keep everything aligned to the axes. What does that mean exactly? Well, Rhino always calls out 2 to 3 axes. So you have your Y, which is always represented by the green line. You have your red, representing X. And you have Z, which would show up as blue. But if you notice, if I double click on the viewport perspective, title again to back out into 4 view, on your right view, your X is actually your Y, and your Y is actually your Z. Whereas in your front view, your X is your X, and your Y is your Z. You can get a little confusing, but just know that X and Y are constant in top and perspective view, right? They're the same. And front and right view can just facilitate you drawing things vertically. That's all you really need to take. But for ortho, if I enable ortho, it's going to lock me into just drawing on those axes. I can't draw any diagonal lines or anything curved. So if I'm drawing a floor, that's going to be fine. I can have ortho on. I'm going to hit on the box command to start drawing a box. I'm typing in 0, enter to start drawing at the center. And then I'll type 20 and 20, enter, and then 20 again, and enter, so that my X and my Y are both 20. And now I'm establishing my height for the box, and I'll just leave it at 1. There we have our floor plate. Now, the next thing would be planar. right? So with planar enabled, right? If I go and draw into the right view with planar view on, everything I draw, right? Even though I just started drawing from the right view, it's snapped onto that corner of the floor plate. Start drawing up, and I start drawing over to the right. And then I try to have it make it connect back to the floor plate. It's going to stay on that same edge that I started drawing from because planar is enabled. So it won't deviate from the 2D plane that you started drawing from. If I turn planar off and I try doing that again, there is a chance that when I try to reconnect it to the floor plate, it's going to search for a different plane. Or I have the option to create a diagonal line. Notice I can switch between viewports to finish drawing the line, right? So I was able to start drawing on this plane and then switch over to creating that diagonal because planar was off. I wouldn't have been able to create that diagonal without planar, with planar being off. Okay, the next thing down here is object snaps. So OSnaps, object snap, right, is enabled already. If I disable it, you'll notice that the bar that I had up here is now ghosted. I can't use it. Here, that object snap. So if I try to draw my walls now with another box, I can't start drawing the wall based off of my floor, right? That's because object snaps is off. Turn it on, right? Now I can select what I can snap to. So I'm going to turn off near because near is just, I'll leave middle, I'll leave intersection, I'll turn on perpendicular. So I can now snap onto one of these edges and start drawing. Now notice that I can't set that length along here. So maybe I do want to enable near so that I can simply, near just means along a line or along an edge. It's on that edge, but it's nowhere specifically. Draw my wall right here to reach up to that diagonal. So notice I just did something there too to clean up the model, right? We're not actually working our design just yet. We'll just interface. I'm not quite concerned with what we're modeling. So to get rid of these curves, right? Let's say I want to select them both at once. Well, there's multiple ways I could do that, right? Get rid of them. So if I select on it once here, I could hit delete on this one. And then I could click on the other one and delete that one too. But I could click on one and then to add to that selection, if I wanted to select something and then keep selecting other objects, I can hold shift to add objects to that selection. Same way, I can hold control to take away from that selection. Also, there's two types of selection boxes you can make. You drag from the right side of the screen. If you click and drag from the right side of the screen to the left, you start drawing this box. It has a dashed border, right? So anything this box comes into contact with is going to get selected. However, if I start drawing from left to right, there's no dashed line. It's a solid line. And anything that has to be selected by this box has to be contained within the box. So that's why just now I was able to only select that. Delete both. Also, let's keep going with the status bar. So Smart Track we already went over. Gumball. You may have noticed that when I select something, I get this different colored gumball, what it's called, in the center of the object. Okay. So this allows you to do many transformation operations without using commands. So the gumball allows you to move the object by clicking and dragging on the arrows, right? Clicking and dragging on the arcs, you're able to rotate it. So I still have ortho on, which is why I'm only able to rotate 90 degrees. I'm using Command Z, Control Z, or Command C on a Mac to undo. And I'll go ahead and disable ortho so you can see what I mean with the gumball. So there I am rotating freely. And you could also scale with the squares here. So you could do scale, you could do rotate, you could do move with the gumball. If the gumball is kind of in your way, this circle that's kind of diagonally jetting out from the center of the gumball allows you to relocate the gumball, as well as other options. Hold your click on it, gives you many other options. All right. Last thing to go over for the interface is the panels on the right side. There's other things in the interface that will come up, but I just want to get you with the essentials. So you'll notice that here for the color wheel, right on the right hand side, we have properties. So properties, and we have our view properties, right? We get the camera selected. So very, very simple. Here we can just see some settings that are set up for the viewport. So the title's perspective, here's the pixels and width, right? The projection is in perspective. You could change it to parallel, to 2-point perspective. You can lock the viewport so you can't edit it anymore. Lens length, so you go for a wider angle. Instead of 50, which was the default, to 24. Get a wider angle view on your model, or you can get a telescopic view by going higher, closer to your parallel projection. And as you can see, as I'm orbiting around, the camera data is changing, so you can always change your camera. Moving on, well, not moving on from properties just yet, because if you select an object, you'll notice the properties change from camera to the object. So we'll be going over all the object properties in this course once we get into material, texturing, some of the more advanced stuff. But very simple things like changing what layer an object is on can be done here. What its display color is, if you want to establish a line type, and so on. Here's where you find your settings per object. So now we're going to move on to the next tab called layers. And by the way, if there's any tab here that you don't have, you can always find it by coming over here to the top menu and going to panels. And panels here are all the different windows that you can have open for Rhino that allow you to have more settings for your project. So you want to make sure that you have your layers on, and you can always click and drag these tabs to move them around. So right there, I clicked and dragged layers, and now it's isolated in its own window. And I can move that window around by clicking and dragging here. If I wanted to reincorporate layers into that window, I have to click and drag the layers tab. Place it right. And I can reorganize. So layers, you want to organize your different objects into layers. So here are your layer titles. You can click to change the title of it. And you also have what layer is active. So right now, the check mark is on default. So I've been working on default layer. I also know that because everything I've drawn is represented in the same color as that layer, which is set to black, right? You can also set materials for your layer, line types for your layer, and so on. Notice that you can't hide or lock your active layer. So say I wanted to lock or hide the default layer, well, that means that I have to start working in a different layer. So I can just click the check mark column here for layer 1 to start working layer 1 and hide or lock that default layer. And I can start drawing on layer 1 that it now is in the same color as that layer. Go to shaded. It's also shaded in the color for. All right, so that concludes our interface. There's, of course, many more things to go over on the interface. You might have noticed I might have skipped some things here and there in the areas that I was explaining. That's because I really just wanted to hit you with the things that are going to be coming up the most, right? It's not the most exciting lesson or video to watch or go over, but it's a video you're probably going to have to come back to quite a lot throughout this course. So take note of those things that have come up in this video, because they're going to be very useful, and you really want to get into the repetitive habit of doing things properly and correctly. Is down the line, it's going to pay off way, way better to be organized and know where things are and know how to use things to the best of their ability than to do things just the way that they're working right now and develop some bad habits later on in the software that could complicate. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.